I ran out of newspaper. Now what do I do?
Hey, you. Why don't you come down here and start a new row?
Great idea, Spider-Man.
Nice spider swing, Shorty.
Good.
But you gotta work on those landings.
Right. Look, the warehouse. Hey, who are you?
Spider Girl, of course.
Well, this is my adventure, Spider Girl.
Oh, yeah? Well, you're not gonna catch too many bad guys hanging from a flagpole.
Is that so?
Boy, you gotta work on those landings.
I know.
Listen, Spider Dog. I'm the only spider hero around here, see?
No way, Spider Girl. I'm the spider hero around here. Watch.
Yeah, you missed me. Wow.
Didn't miss you that time.
Oh, yeah. Hey, coming at you, you spider pet.
Bouncing babies. Looks like I'll have to handle this caper myself.
Hey, you kids. Cut that out. Don't you know there's only one Spider-Man?
Sorry, Mr. Hero.
Come on, Wolf. Let's get out of here.
Oh, boy.
Now, Abe, I assume in your extensive research for your new book, True Believer, The Rise and Fall of Stan Lee, you probably spent a good amount of time poring over episodes of Muppet Babies. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, I should have, because Muppet Baby was a key component of the persistent existence of Marvel Productions. Marvel Productions, of course, being I don't need to go down that rabbit hole, but that was a great clip.
I'm probably alone in this. I know I suspect Heidi is not on the same boat. Anthony may or may not, but I think that Muppet Babies clip was actually my first exposure to Stan Lee as a human being, as a real life person. Yeah, as a person in front of the camera. Now, obviously, he's kind of primarily, I think, known as far as the zeitgeist is concerned as a cameo machine.
Well, you could see that Stan's acting chops were already finely honed in that clip. So,
Yeah. I love tracing the evolution of the Stan Lee cameo, the concept of the Stan Lee cameo, which goes farther back than you'd think and has a very weird circuitous route. But yeah, that was fascinating. I love that it sort of turned into the pointing Spider-Man meme briefly.
Right? It came so close.
Two spider people in an alley.
Yeah.
I will say it was longer than I remember it being as I was watching.
That's always the case when you play a clip at a presentation. It always is three times as long as it felt. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
All of it was gold, though.
Yes, it was really magical. And having it be that long, you really got into the zone of whatever it is that they were doing. And then the Stan cameo was a big surprise. You're like, okay, well, what are we watching here? And then bam. Anyway,
I remember watching Scooby-Doo, just hoping, because in the introductory credit scenes they would show Batman, and I would just sit and maybe watch 2 minutes of a Scooby-Doo episode, see if Batman showed up, and then just turn it off if he wasn't there. This was the original sort of greatest crossover of all time.
I did watch that.
This was the Infinity War of its time.
Yeah,
yes.
That was. I'm saying, the whole new. It was actually Spider-Verse with the Spider Dog, Spider Girl. I mean, it really was introducing that whole concept. So
it was. That's how we got there.
Mm-hmm.
Great. So I let me just kick things off by introducing everybody. My name is Brian Heater. I am the host of RIYL, which is where this is being hosted. I'm also an editor at TechCrunch. I am joined by Anthony Ha, who is also of TechCrunch fame.
Hello.
Heidi Mcdonald of The Beat and Publishers Weekly.
hello.
and Abraham Riesman, who is kind of the man of the hour. The book officially dropped. Was it yesterday?
I've lost all sense of time, but it was Tuesday. Whatever day was Tuesday this week.
That would be
I think
yesterday.
that was yesterday. Yes.
Yes, that. But however, in Spider Clips, that was 8,402. So you're.
I would say in Spider Clips that was probably 2. Based on the length of that specific Spider Clip.
But yeah, no, it came out yesterday, and it's people seem to really like it. I'm very flattered.
Is it? I mean, obviously, this is something you had been working on for a long time, and you've been
not as long as you'd think. That's the thing. This book came together relatively quickly. I mean, in one way, and then in another way, not so much. I started the research for back when I was doing an article. I wrote a profile of Stan that ran in early 2016. I started researching it in late summer 2015. So that took about 6 months to happen. Even that is kind of a weird timeline because for a lot of it, it was just on hold. But, so let's say like about 6 months doing that. And then I was done. The article was out and I moved on with my life, did other things. And then, I followed along a little bit. Not just a little bit. I followed along while all of the sort of, big news stories about the bad things that were happening in his life were going on, but I wasn't, really writing about it. And then when Stan passed away in November of 2018, an editor at Penguin Random House at their Crown imprint reached out about me writing a biography to sort of build that out. And that only, that deal was closed in December, and I had to turn in the first draft the following December. So it was really only 1 year of concentrated work just on this.
Living rent-free in Stan's head.
Or vice versa, something like that. Yeah. It's a little like MC Escher, who's, yeah. Anyway, but yeah, so it was about a year, and then give or take a few months, a few years prior to that.
So you must have been writing and doing a lot of the additional research kind of in parallel then, because just writing a book of this length in a year seems insane.
Yeah. It was a lot of it was. Most of it I did. I shouldn't even say most of it because I did a lot of research before I started writing. But yes, even as I was writing, I was still doing continuous research on things that couldn't have been wrapped. Either were taking a long time or were events that only happened, blah, 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 while I was working on it. But yeah, it was a challenge to juggle all of that. I hope I pulled it off. There are elements of triage that give me imposter syndrome because it's like, I hope nobody asks me about this one thing that I didn't get to research as much as I would have liked.
Oh, they will. They will.
I know they will. I'm already starting to get a little bit of it in the like hardcore, Facebook groups, the closed groups for the like comics diehards. So nothing like that's a major like that's like a factual error, but just this guy clearly doesn't understand this run of Fantastic Four, and it's like, well, I don't know, maybe I didn't read it as closely as I could have. But yes,
do you know who Bob Bierbaum is?
Yes, and not like wait, why?
Well, I'm just saying. So Bob Bierbaum is, he was one of the first comics retailers, one of the first comics back in the 60s. And he's very active on Facebook, telling you all the things that he knows and he did and that you don't know. And
I'm staying out of it. I will say, just to make it clear, one of the reasons I'm in these groups is a lot of people who are the sort of hardcore, intense comics historians and experts in these Facebook groups were really very instrumental for me. I was building on a lot of research that had been done by people who are not like professional historians, professional journalists. They're really just in it for the love of the game and for wanting to get to the bottom of how this industry worked, how certain people interacted, et cetera, et cetera. So those, I don't mean to like throw those people under the bus. It's just, sometimes they have high standards. Let's say
yes, they do have high standards.
They have high standards.
Yes, and they're comics historians. Just they're continuity buffs.
You gotta be. It's the only way to keep up. But,
I mean, for a medium that is constantly shifting continuities.
Yeah. So anyway, I can't remember what your question was now.
Well, let me ask you. I think that this is kind of top of mind right now because Rush Limbaugh, R.I.P., died earlier today.
Wow, I'm very curious about where you're going with this one, Brian.
I think. Well, I think maybe we weren't all fans of his broadcast, but we can all agree his politics were good. Like, I think we're so when he died on Twitter, on all social media,
when he died on Twitter, sorry,
when he died,
comma, on
space,
Twitter,
on Twitter, there was the same discussion that we have every single time a very bad person dies, which is the question of speaking ill of the dead, right?
That's where we're going with this. Okay, yeah.
And obviously, you know, it was Stanley's death that kind of spurred, it sounds like, was really lit a fire under you to write the book. I mean, is there, I guess the broad question is, you know, is there, do you feel like you at first had to hold anything back when it came to kind of really, you know, digging up the dirty details?
No, I mean, I didn't hold anything back in terms of looking for things. And I didn't hold anything back in terms of writing it that, you know, no, I didn't feel like I had a responsibility to preserve someone's image. I mean, journalism is a weird, you know, it's a weird industry. It's a weird art form. And sometimes it involves, you know, writing in a way that can hurt feelings, you know, and people are very passionate about Stan. And I respect that. I was not coming at this project from a perspective of like wanting to irritate people or, you know, be a troll or get back at, you know, the fans or whatever. You know, what I found is what I found, and I tried to synthesize it in the best way that I could. And oh, there it is. And it's really a great. Sorry, as a side note, the design is amazing.
It is actually. It's really
stunning. It was the photo. Just to give a shout out, the photo was taken by Alan Amato, who I found the backstory of it from Alan. It was taken at a shoot for a Kevin Smith project. He was taking photos of people who were involved. He didn't remember what it was, but I'm guessing it was Yoga Hosers, which Stan has a cameo in. So they were taking photos, and basically there was like 3 minutes left at the shoot before Stan had to go. And Alan was like, "Can I just get like some portrait shots of you, just solo stuff?" And he basically got maybe, according to him, like 20 seconds of Stan not making a big smile. You know, like this image that you're seeing lasted. It was just this flash of a moment that almost didn't happen if he hadn't said, "Hey, can we just, you know, the Columbo style, let's just do one more thing." And then the design is by Christopher Brand, who also designed the cover of Ready Player One, which I think we can all agree, Ready Player One, whatever you think of the content, it's a great cover. It's like a really memorable one that people, anyway, sorry. I appreciate the craft of this book because I had nothing to do with the design. I just feel like people don't get recognized.
I think it's great. I think that's awesome to call out designer, the photo of the designer.
Well, it just, I don't know. As soon as I just realized that I'd been staring at this cover for like a year, because of course my book had been delayed, and had just been enchanted by it. And it had become, you know, just part of, you know, the cover of my website is just this book cover, and then a little menu. And I wanted to know what the origin of it was. And so anyway, Christopher Brand never got back to me, but Alan was kind enough to give me a little story. Anyway, I don't know if that was interesting at all, but what was I talking about?
Well, let me ask a follow-up question to Brian.
Yes, go ahead.
Brian, to dig into that a little bit more, because I think one of the things about writing about Stanley, I would imagine, is that, and I remember this, I brought this very mindset into it when I read the article you wrote for New York Magazine, is that I'm a hardcore Jack Kirby fan. I have a Jack Kirby tattoo, and like that I was like, he better like give Kirby his due. There are things where I don't think I can do it in this order. Maybe at the end. But
stick around till the end, and okay. Get weird.
There's a certain audience, right, who knows all about Kirby versus Lee versus Ditko, and yet there's also the public thing, which is Stan Lee invented the Marvel universe, which is part of what I think the book is kind of showing is maybe not the case. And one of the ways you try to talk about that is you say that there are the things that Stan was really good at, and there are the things that he's not so good at. And sort of the shame of it is that in a lot of ways he's kind of famous for things that maybe are a little bit more debatable. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about that idea.
Sure.
Like, what do you think he was good at?
Well, this dovetails with what we were just talking about, which is I did not write this book to be a hatchet job and say Stan did nothing. Stan was a talentless hack. There are people in the aforementioned Facebook groups who'd love it if I would say that. but that's not how I feel. I mean, it's not about my feelings. It's, you know, what you actually see. There were tremendous achievements that he made. You know, he was, although it's debatable what he created of the Marvel characters when it comes to the interconnected Marvel universe, you know, Kirby explicitly didn't like that. That was Stan. Nobody else was taking credit for that. You know, and then there's, you know, obviously the dialogue narration that's been done to death and the salesmanship. But, you know, I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Well,
I'm kind of burnt out from doing a million interviews. I apologize. I get, somebody asked me a question and I think which of the topics is this? Right?
Let me actually, I'd like to bring Heidi on this, because obviously Heidi's been following this for a while. And, you know, and Anthony, one of the things that you and I were talking about earlier is like, certainly in the comics community, it was, I don't even want to say open secret. It was pretty widely acknowledged that, you know, maybe the artists were doing more heavy lifting with a lot of this, or certainly that sure. That Stan was taking perhaps potentially more credit than he deserved. I mean, Heidi, as somebody who's been following this for a really long time, where do you land on all of that?
Well, first off, a lot of people in the comics industry actually worked with Stan Lee. You know, sure. I mean, the guy had a long career, and absolutely. And so there was a lot of firsthand knowledge of Stan. And, you know, when you say it was an open secret, I mean, you know, it was kind of just taken for granted that Stan was this lovable but bombastic, you know, credit stealing kind of figurehead. But also, I never have heard anyone say that he wasn't an outstanding editor. And
yes, exactly. Right.
Yes. And
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, just that's, you know, no, but even people who disliked some of Stan's other characteristics never have said anything but that he was a really good story man and a really good editor, and, you know, really good to work with. Yeah.
Yes. A good art director too.
Yeah.
People really liked him in that. I'm sorry, I keep talking over you.
No. I'm just like, he knew he knew his stuff about how to actually, you know, run a comics line. I mean, Stan was incredibly smart about that, obviously, or he wouldn't have done it from when he was a teenager. And, you know, look, I'm a Kirby girl also. Okay. And you can't deny just the genius of Jack Kirby. And, you know, look, the bottom line, I just say this to everybody, and it's the conversation, it's kind of, you know, mic drop, like, without Stan, Jack created the Newsboy Legion, co-created Captain America, co-created Romance Comics, he co-created the Fourth World, he created Mr. Miracle, the Eternals. You know, without Jack, Stan created Stripperella. So,
which is an interesting story in and of itself. I was very glad that I was able to tell the story of Stripperella in this book, but
yeah.
Go on. Yes.
Yeah. But I mean that, you know, that's it, you know, and guess what? That's a great editor. It's a great editor who knows how to get collaborators that are going to make you look good. So,
absolutely.
Let me interject. So the Stripperella question, you know, the way I think about this
question.
My first of many Stripperella questions
yes.
is the way I tend to think of this is, you know, and I know it's not a one-to-one analog, but, you know, I write about music a lot. I cover music a lot. And obviously when we think of pop musicians, there's a period of, and painters, probably just creative people in general, there's kind of a window where they're most creative and where they do the best work. So, you know, I wonder how much of the sort of the later period stuff that he was doing, where in some cases, obviously he was just sort of sticking his name on it, but how much of it was really that Stan Lee would have created Stripperella in 1964 if Jack Kirby wasn't around, and how much of it was just like, this is a guy who's been doing this for a long time and maybe he's not as sharp as he used to be, or his heart isn't in it in the same way that it was during, you know, the heyday of Marvel.
Yeah, I mean, you know, when he's doing stuff like Stripperella, you have to remember that also he wasn't really doing much of that. You know, there's obviously like credit disputes about what he was doing in the 60s, but like when you get to Stripperella, just to use it as an example, because it was something that I reported out, you know, the origin of that was Stan was at a party with Pamela Anderson's brother, happened to be there, and they struck up a conversation. And one thing that Stan often did was if he ran into a celebrity or somebody was connected with a celebrity at a party or something, he would start pitching them on, you know, I can make you into a superhero or a comic book character, whatever. And so what appears to have happened was he said that to Pam Anderson's brother, and all they came up with was Stripperella, stripper by day, and then I can't remember exactly what the phrase was, but like evil, fighting evil later. I'm sorry, stripper by night, fighting evil later by night, and that was it. That was all
later in the evening.
Right, later in the. I screwed up the rollout.
Yeah, Stan got it right. Just to point out,
Stan got it right. I'm sure he got it right on the first time. But the point was that was all they had. There was no story beyond that. And they were able to sell that to TNN, which was about to become Spike TV. And basically they found two of the showrunners of all that, the Nickelodeon show, and said, do you want to do this Stan Lee show? It's called Stripperella. And they said, well, what is it? And they said, well, I'll tell you what it is. It premieres on March 26th or whatever the date it was. And, they really didn't have any information about it. So they just sort of built it from the ground up. And so it gets, I see your point about saying maybe he had the hot streak and then later it was not so hot, but it's hard. It's kind of apples and oranges, because after a certain point, he wasn't really doing all that many, new ideas. I mean, that's really sort of the beginning of the 21st century when he gets into that. But I guess you're right. Earlier, there's a period where he's coming up with a lot of treatments and scripts, not that many scripts, mostly treatments and pitches. And they're things that didn't work out. I don't want to put on my critic hat too much, but they were not things that other people were interested in picking up. And does that mean that the 60s were a fluke? Does it mean that, it was all Jack? I don't know. It's really, unfortunately, it's one of those things that you have to live with, which is ambiguity.
Sure, but
we'll never know whether that. I'm sorry, maybe I misunderstood your question.
No. I'm just saying, and this is something probably that Heidi or Anthony can answer better than I can. I mean, I will completely contrast what I just said earlier by saying that if you want to control, look at the stuff that Kirby, for example, did after Marvel.
Sure.
To a lot of people, that was his best stuff, to a lot of people.
The Fourth
like
World and Eternals, and Eternals is less beloved, but definitely Fourth World and like OMAC, Commandy. Sure. And after Stan, as you say, the only thing that was really memorable that people remember at all, and it's not very fondly, is Stripperella. But I guess the reason I was stammering around that is like, that's still circumstantial evidence. It doesn't fully prove, unless I don't know. Are you talking about the creation of the Marvel characters? Was that what you were getting at, or?
No, I'm just saying that I'm saying again, I think you reiterated my point, which is basically that, it's not one-to-one. It's not saying that you can't really say that because he was making Stripperella when Jack Kirby wasn't around, does it
that
mean
he needed
that,
Jack Kirby and that was the only thing,
or that was the extent of his creative abilities.
I think what this shows really though is also, who do you surround yourself with? And Stan was a great editor. I'm sure in your book you mentioned the Joe Maneely paradox or enigma.
Oh, sure. Well, right? Yeah, Joe Maneely. Yeah. Well, we can get into that if you want.
He wanted Joe Maneely. He thought he was the greatest. Stan thought Joe Maneely was the greatest artist in comics. Tragically, Joe Maneely died, so he had
young.
And he had to hire Jack Kirby. So
the timing is eerie on that,
right?
In fact.
And I think really what you're seeing is that Stan, as he got older, and as the Marvel universe became bigger and bigger and bigger, I'm sure that went to his head a little bit, and he surrounded himself more with people who didn't push back as much, against him. And I was reading the section of the book about Stanley Entertainment, which was excellent.
Stanley Media, you mean?
Yeah, Stanley Media. And there were so many people who worked there, and
there were a lot of really talented people who worked there.
There were, and why did they languish? I mean, the company was a shell company set up as a stock, pumping operation, I guess. And but it.
But also the pitches weren't, there's something lacking. Again,
right,
I don't want to get too much in my critic hat, but still, it's like the Backstreet Project, the Backstreet Boys tie-in. I don't think there's a whole lot of people out there defending that on aesthetic grounds. Maybe future generations will have a critical reassessment.
But I mean, Abe, you and I talked about this a long time ago, and I had like I was on the beat. I'm fascinated by the many
Yeah,
packs
you
of
got
Stan Lee.
That's all. That's chapter 9. Chapter
Yeah,
9 of my
right?
book is
Oh,
just the
right.
period with Pow, where it was just
And it
day
was,
after day, you'd get a press release saying, "Here's this new partnership that Stan Lee is doing," whether it's the NHL or Arnold Schwarzenegger, or
Arnold
Playboy.
NHL, man, that was what an amazing project.
Yeah,
all new mascots.
Yeah,
for every team in the NHL.
It was supposed to be the NFL, and they backed out. But yeah, I think I'm remembering that correctly. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was not aware that Heidi. So he was brought on to redesign the mascots.
Yeah, no, not redesign. Create all new mascots.
Create new mascots.
And they debuted people in costumes for them at the NHL All-Star game. Right during the halftime, they came out and skated around, and they were like, here's, I don't remember their names, but here's like, Ice Duck, and like
one of them, the Carolina Panthers. It was the Panther, and the design looked like Black Panther.
Stick with what like secret gems from this period that are just waiting for rediscovery, or
that's the thing. Maybe, I mean, one of the things that I find interesting is I wonder if Stan might have had a different career if he'd gone sort of on the direction of like one of his friends, Lloyd Kaufman of Troma. I don't know if you're familiar with Troma, the sort of, right. Okay, great. And
with Lloyd Kaufman, the last living Stan Lee, so.
Right.
He's a raconteur and
what I wonder, I was interviewing Lloyd because they were friends, somewhat close. I said, do you think Stan would have liked to do what you do? And he wasn't sure, but the more I thought about it, I wondered, if he'd really had the opportunity if he could have allowed himself to embrace the fact that he often was surrounded by this stuff that was kind of, schlocky or maybe playing on stuff that you might call cliched. If he'd really embraced that, it might have been a wildly different last few decades of his career. If he'd like gone in the direction of embracing B movies or Z movies or whatever, and putting stuff together like that, you could have had a very different, but he was always aspiring to be at the top rung.
Yeah. I mean, I will say looking at something like Stripperella, it's very much a product of its time. I mean, Heidi.
Oh God. Yeah. The Spike TV era.
Spike TV, but also remember like Virgin Comics, or I think there was like a Janet Jameson comics where there was this moment where everybody thought that, producing a comic was the quickest road into Hollywood, and suddenly every celebrity had one. It was the app of the of the turn of the century.
And we're just getting into aughts nostalgia now, and it's going to be some awesome stuff there. And I chronicled the aughts so closely at the Beat in the early, because the Beat started in 2002, so I was right there, the heart of it. So
yeah. Pretty soon we're gonna have, what was Maximum Security? Remember that one? Well, the one where Marvel, like the Earth becomes a prison for space, and everybody's trapped inside prison Earth. Well, I'm sure we'll get a revival of that. I
think Top Cow is overdue for a big comeback.
That's a whole other story, but yeah. Anyway,
speaking of things that are of their time, I mean, I guess one of the other things where I think you did wear your critic hat a little bit in the book, Abe, was like talking about that if you read Fantastic Four #1 right now, and I did have this experience as like, I think somebody reading Origins of Marvel Comics when I was, 10 or 15.
Sure.
Is that, that those comics themselves are very much of their times, and you wouldn't, if somebody had like told you this was the greatest superhero comic of all time, and then you read Fantastic Four #1, you wouldn't necessarily be blown away. And at the same time, I did then, after reading your book, I went back and reread some of the sort of peak Kirby Lee Fantastic Fours, and some of them do hold up really well. But I'm curious what your experience was like just of rereading those comics. Do you feel like there's something that, somebody who's like a contemporary Marvel fan should be going back to and revisiting?
I mean, it sounds kind of basic, but the Galactus Trilogy. I mean, the Galactus Trilogy is fascinating. There are parts of it that work, and the parts that I don't even want to say they don't work. I mean, like the interlude where they're shaving, the fact that it ends with Johnny going to college, the weird contours of the Galactus Trilogy that augment the experience of this really astounding tale that has actual very, somewhat memorable lines of dialogue. And I don't know. I enjoyed that. I enjoyed the Dr. Doom stories. I just recorded an episode of Douglas Wolk's upcoming podcast Oh wait, no, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say that. Never mind. I won't give any details of that. I don't know if I was supposed to say that, but we were discussing. Oh God, now I can't even tell you what the issue was.
Yeah. Well, never mind. Anyway,
but there's good stuff back there. But I don't know that I would recommend any of it to somebody who's a novice, or somebody.
It's not where you should start, but I do think people should go back to it.
Oh sure. Oh, so you mean like people who are Yes. Go back and revisit the Dr. Doom stories, especially. I love the evolution of Doom over the course of, I wrote a whole essay years ago about how Doom is the best supervillain, which, sounds like a cheap headline, but I tried to put as much thought into it as I could. And they really just, there are so many knockoff Dr. Dooms that Stan and Jack put together, like in terms of the way they talk or just sort of the imperiousness, whatever. But Doom himself remains this indelible character, and that's true really throughout the run. There are other examples I could get into, but I don't know. I think if you're trying to understand Stan, though, and I'll fully confess, I did not reread as many comics as I would have liked because I did only have a year. And the trouble is when I had to triage things, very often it was going back and reading or rereading the massive corpus of comics. Because if I erred on that side, I would just never reach the end of that in time. But B, it becomes complicated when you're thinking about, okay, well, is this a Stan comic or is this a Jack comic? On any given issue, it may have been more in one direction, more in the other direction, or it may well have been what Jack said, which is pretty much every issue was like just Jack's idea, Jack plowing ahead. But even then, Stan adding the dialogue and narration is interesting. The trouble is it becomes kind of this miasma where you can't very firmly say, oh, and here's this, Stan was going through this personal crisis, so this thing reads as autobiographical. It could be just a complete coincidence because this was something where the authorship was not as singular and auteur-like as you'd like it to be. So I think it's worth starting from number one with Fantastic Four if if you're not coming at it as a beginner. If you're just saying people should revisit, it can't hurt to start with like the first. I'm sorry, I'm rambling now, but if you start at the beginning, you get to see the real evolution of both the artwork, the dialogue, the concept, and watching that evolution from a historian's perspective is perhaps the most interesting thing you can see when you're rereading something like the Fantastic Four.
Stan did come back with at least one book that I do think, is worth revisiting, which, Silver Surfer.
Silver Surfer Parable.
The Mobius book.
Yeah, the Mobius one.
Famous from Crimson Tide, right?
Totally.
And, he got to make his mark in the graphic novel era, I guess you could say. It was a very early graphic novel era, but he got to do that. I think just look, you can listen to Flaming Pie by Wings and think it's a good album, and really like Paul McCartney.
I think it was just McCartney solo Flaming Pie.
Yeah. Well, anyway.
Ram. Yeah.
Yes. Anyway,
Sorry,
Band on the Run. Actually,
Band
on the Run is a really great
Band on the Run's a really good
record. I love it. Is. It's a great album. Okay, and you could listen to Imagine.
I can go into solo McCartney, but Wings,
yes.
it never.
So you can like both of those albums, and you can still like the Beatles.
Sure.
And that's really what it was. As far as because Stan's greatest creation was Stan. Right?
Sure. Absolutely.
That's it. Yeah.
And that's one that he designed, not just in terms of character and words, but visuals too.
Yeah. And I would just, from my own standpoint, I met Stan, I met Jack, and, I saw a lot of this unfolding in my own long years of life. That's my tree beard analogy there. I have to always bring it back to Tolkien. But, Stan created this myth, and that's what he was the most interested in, I think, in his second part of his life, or the third or fourth part.
Sure. Well, the Stan character doesn't really come into full flower until the 70s. Mm-hmm. Like in the 60s, you go back, as late as the late 60s, he's still sporting the full beard, not doing the shades, no mustache, and had not really perfected the delivery of the character as well. When I was in the Stanley Archives in Wyoming, I watched this little film strip, this sizzle reel that Stan put together with Marvel in 1965 to try and sell the cartoon that became the big Grant Trey Lawrence cartoon in 1966. And in the pitch mode, they're showing clips from the sizzle, but when he's presenting, he just, you'd never know it was Stan Lee. He's bald. Mm-hmm. clean shaven.
I didn't know about the toupee until I read your book, which
yes,
I'm so
yeah,
embarrassed to
toupee,
admit.
which he had. When I went into the research, I knew other people had said that he had a toupee. I did not realize that he himself had admitted it on a few occasions. But anyway, the point is, he's in this clip. Not only does he look nothing like Stan Lee, he's looking at the camera and he goes, "Hello, my name's Stan Lee, editor of the Marvel Comics Group of comics magazines." And it's same when you watch also in the archives his failed 1968 talk show pilot, the political talk show, which again, when he's talking, he just doesn't sound like Stan Lee. He had not fully refined what that character looked and sounded like, and would not until the 70s. And you're right, that's after he's like having the streak where he's really known for the comics he's writing, or participating in writing. And that's when he sort of crafts the most lasting thing that his legacy, the most lasting thing for his legacy. Because you think about it, now being in the Marvel movies with the cameos, it's so far removed from anyone saying, in the movie, this guy is the comics writer. They're just showing the face. They're having the voice. That is the iconography. And you have the association like, oh, he did something with Marvel. I can't remember, but he's like the father of Marvel, or he bought Marvel. What, I don't know, but he's fun to look at. And I like seeing him there, and I know what he looks like, and I know what he sounds like. And that's an extremely important piece of, to use an abused word, branding. And Stan did branding before branding was a thing, for better and worse.
My favorite thing about all of this is that record, the Merry
Marvel Marching Society. Yeah, the record. You belong.
Yeah, but I mean, when there's this little audio play with Stan and Jack and Flo, and it's it's priceless.
It's fascinating. Well, and in the book,
I never get tired of listening to that.
And there's a whole story behind that.
You never remember anything.
Uncanny, you nailed. Well, that's a whole interesting story too, where Stan in his memoir was like, "Oh, we made that record because everybody was having such a great time in the bullpen, and we decided that we should go record something, and we were ad-libbing back and forth." And then Jack's version of it was like, he made us rehearse this thing over and over again. He did all these rewrites. He forced us to lose a day of work. We didn't get to eat lunch. We went to the recording studio. It was a hassle. Steve was smart because he didn't show up for that. So, differing tales of how the 1960s went. That's something you have to keep coming back to with Stan.
So this is a question for either one of you. What is your impression of the switch that flipped in the 70s? Was it just that, was it the comics becoming more iconic and he felt the need to?
You mean like when he became
when did Stan Lee become, why did Stan Lee become Stan Lee when he became
the character? It's multi-determinant, but that was, I can have theories. One is that's when he really started becoming a pitchman in Hollywood, and because he was the publisher and briefly the president, he was more of a he was in the C-suite. He was an executive and also was somebody who was flying back and forth from LA trying to get Marvel movies made. It's entirely possible that in this process of having to sell Marvel at a higher level, maybe, I don't know, maybe it's that, maybe it was just sort of evolution. It was, dinosaurs becoming birds, because all these elements are present going way, way back. Not all, some of the elements are, some of them develop over time. Some of them are apart and then knit together to become one thing. But I don't know there's any one switch flip moment where Stan just decided to become the final form that we see him in. It happens, it wasn't like he went in, it's one of those costume montage moments where it's like, do I do this one or do I do this one? I don't think there was a moment of that.
Super Saiyan.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think there was something like that. I think it was sort of a gradual change, but it may have been spurred on by the fact that he had to sell in a different way than he had been in the 60s. Maybe.
Well, I think I'm just guessing here, but I imagine that when he went to Hollywood,
right,
like
which
Hollywood,
is the 80s. Well, when you start, go ahead.
Right, yeah, but I mean, I imagine as he became more ensconced in that world, as you say, and he was out there being the pitchman for Marvel movies, right, and with horrible results. Films that we are just legendarily bad now. I mean, that wasn't necessarily Stan, but he signed he would pact with anyone. Stan was a pacting slut. Let's face it.
Okay.
Was that like the Corman era? That's a little early. That's before the Corman Fantastic Four, right?
Corman Fantastic Four is later 80s into 90.
Yeah, but a lot of these deals have dragged on for a long time also.
Yeah, it's more like, like Dolph Lundgren Punisher, Howard the Duck, that sort of thing.
Or the J.D. Salinger's son.
Yeah, Matt Salinger as Captain America,
which I loved as a kid. I have not gone back to it.
Interesting. I will fully confess, I have not seen the Matt Salinger Captain America. I have not indulged.
Yeah, I think it's fine. I think it's fine for children. I mean, it was a period when it was like, it was you had Superman, and then you had the Tim Burton Batman, and that was kind of it for live action superheroes at the time.
Yeah, so at least decent ones. Yeah. Right. Well, right. Go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna say, in the same way that I was watching Muppet Babies or Scooby-Doo hoping to see Batman, like you would take what you could get in that era.
And part of it was, well, that gets another thing where Stan had ideas sometimes for movies that were laughed out of the room, maybe partly because they were ideas that people thought were silly, but also because the technology wasn't there. So when you say there's the Burton Batman, there's the Donner Superman, it was very hard at scale to make superhero movies look cool, both because of CGI and costume technology and makeup technology. So you have examples of like Stan going practically door to door in Hollywood saying, Ant-Man is the next is our meal ticket. He's a man. And as Margaret Lesh, his colleague, said it to me, he would go, he's a man who's the size of an ant. Well, what don't you understand? Like, it makes all the sense in the world. Yeah. So nobody, he's not being picked up for that. But then you flash forward to 2015 and Ant-Man makes $500 million, but you couldn't have made Ant-Man look cool in whatever year that would have been. And so there's a degree to which, you have to wonder if Stan had been out there pitching superhero stuff when you could actually make a superhero movie at scale, whether there would have been more people listening. The answer may be no. I mean, you look at some of the treatments and pitches he was making, and maybe those are, the effects would have been not the main problem. I don't know. It's all
and I mean, at the time, it's a lot like where we see kind of DC characters now. They were in the movies, multi-million dollar movies nowadays, and they don't always hit, although they seem to be doing better, but who knows where that is now. But Marvel had the TV show, the Spider-Man TV show, which the
live action one you're talking about? The live
action one, yes. And then
Nicholas Hammond, who I interviewed, didn't end up in the yeah.
But then the Incredible Hulk, I mean, that show is part of the zeitgeist of that whole period. So, but I mean, look at how they had to do it. It was a little guy and a big guy.
And a big guy. And
yeah.
Wait, so are you guys team superheroes? The technology is finally caught up and superheroes are modern mythology, and we're going to have the Marvel Cinematic Universe will outlive us all? Or are you thinking 10 years from now it'd be like, whoa, isn't it weird when every movie was a superhero movie?
How soon do you think you're going to die? I think and then we'll work backwards.
I have no idea. I learned a long time ago to not predict how long the superhero boom is going to keep going, because I'm not a prognosticator who can be trusted on that. Cause I was like many who thought it would have burst by now. And a lot of smart people thought that. It's funny, you go back to 2008, A.O. Scott wrote this essay for the Times where he's like, superheroes are done. It's too much.
The Ant-Man conversation, Anthony, reminded me of a conversation that you and I were having about Gene Roddenberry and George Lucas. And I wonder if Lucas is either one of them really is perhaps somewhat apt analogy here of somebody who's maybe good at big picture stuff. There's a pretty common consensus that the reason why A New Hope was a successful film was because of all the people he surrounded himself, right? The editors, the special effects, they molded a very chunky lump of
Carrie Fisher do Punch Up on that? I can't remember. Anyway, go ahead.
I think that was,
Yeah.
No, but point being, I wonder if there are parallels between, Stan perhaps being to some degree maybe like a big picture guy, and it took somebody like Ditko or Kirby to really turn it into something great.
You mean, well, but that's presuming that Stan was the one who was having the big picture ideas at the beginning, unless I'm misunderstanding you.
No. And I guess this is, I mean, maybe the better question for you is, do you, having spent, a couple of years working on this book, do you have a better idea than when you started of how things break down? I mean,
of who came up with what? No, I mean, one of the messages of the book is that we're never going to have a smoking gun on that. I mean, one of the messages of the book, rather, I should say, in a broader thematic sense, is that you have to sit and live with ambiguity, whether it's factual ambiguity or moral ambiguity. And it sucks. The human brain does not want to embrace ambiguity. You want to have certainty. That's just how we're designed. But when it comes to the moral ambiguity, that's in the larger questions of like, credit stealing and potential fraud and business dealings, et cetera. But when it comes to the factual ambiguity, it's, it was a fly-by-night industry. Nobody was keeping records of this stuff. There are not really reliable third-party witnesses who are close enough to know conclusively who was coming up with what. I feel like it's kind of running in a hamster wheel the more you try to figure out the exact percentage of who was contributing what. I see there are a lot of like hardcore comics analysts who will look at a given issue and really try to be archaeologists and go, well, this, if you can see this erasure here, this implies this, or like you can see the typeface kind of changes here. So that probably means this text was replaced. You can see that the art is clearly trying to convey this plot beat, but the dialogue is saying it's a completely different plot beat. So then you try and end up with these sort of like estimates of, okay, this issue was more Jack, or this issue was more Stan, or whatever. I just don't think that that's ultimately all that useful in terms of trying to figure out like some specific, parentage for a given issue or for the whole kit and caboodle. You just have to live with the fact that we're probably never going to know, and that there is a decent chance that Stan was really just not involved in the origination of the characters, and that there's a chance, at least in the case of Kirby, that on a given issue, he was just being told by Kirby what the story was going to be, and then he, accepted the art and then did the dialogue and narration. I'm not saying that's necessarily how things happen, but there is that narrative from Jack, and we don't know. Stan's word is the only evidence that we have that he's the guy who created all of these characters. There's no other surviving documentation. There's this memo about the Fantastic Four that you can very easily point out is not certain to have been written before a conversation with Jack Kirby. So you don't know. And yeah, so I guess I walked in I don't think I expected to find the conclusive answer, and I didn't. So I don't think I was disappointed. I decided that there were other questions I thought I could answer that I wanted to get into and spend more time on, or at least that I could get more information on. Even if I can't find a certain answer, I can get more information than what has already been assembled. Because when it comes to the Stan and Jack dispute, I tried to sort of do a digest version of that. And even the digest version has to get into a lot of detail because it's a complicated question. But there are plenty of other places you can look to find, most of them online, not so much in published information, but you can find a much more hardcore breakdown of looking for, evidence in this dispute. And I thought it would just be more worth my time to look at some other things that had been completely unexplored or largely unexplored. And leave this debate to history to a certain extent and say, we're never going to know the exact right answer to that question.
But what's striking to me is also, I would invert it slightly, that we do know a lot, that we know that, that the words are Stan's and that the pictures are Jack's, and that usually it seems like the story was mostly plotted by Jack. And yet so many people are so invested in this question of, I guess, A, origin, and then B, like percentage breakdown, just because I guess, I partly, I don't know, like that, like for a long time, I guess I felt very satisfied. Like, I don't know, they're Kirby Lee comics, and the exact percentage doesn't necessarily matter. But I guess because also there's been so much money at stake, and a good point that you make in the book as well is also because if Stan wasn't really doing a lot of writing in the traditional sense, then he was also stiffing his artists on the writer's fee.
On the writer's fee, yeah, exactly.
But it's fascinating to me that we're so invested in this question of like, is it 70% Jack or is it 80%?
Sure, no, people want to know. I mean, because these are documents that matter a lot to people emotionally, and they matter a lot to people financially and legally.
But also, I think beyond just like the very specific question of who did what, obviously that, maybe shouldn't impact your feeling on the work itself, but it does speak to his character, right? I mean, if this is a book about him as a person, and if in fact, like, he was doing jack shit and taking the credit for it, like that does speak to some sort of to some things about him as a person and as a boss.
Sure. Well, I mean, that's the thing, is you have to, yeah. I mean, there are things that are provable that he was deceiving people about, and it's what we were just talking about with the credits. I mean, he was. You can make this sort of very tortured argument that what he's saying in the credits is not misleading, but it's hard logic to really accept. I mean, he's writing, written by Stan Lee, drawn by, let's say, Jack Kirby. And the fact is, it's just much more of a complicated interplay there, and may well have been, mostly written by Jack Kirby and art by Jack Kirby, and then dialogue and narration by Stan. That stuff is just on the face of it demonstrable. I mean, Stan, by his own admission, would say very often, he stopped doing this later in life, but earlier on, he would say, Jack may tell me the story. He's a better storyteller than I am, or he's a better writer than I am. I mean, this was stuff that was just out there, and yet the credits are not reflecting that. So that just raises the question, about character. And then you start going, well, if he was willing to dissemble about that, then maybe that's true for the creation of the characters themselves. And a lot of that ends up being judgments of whether you think he was the type of person to do it. I mean, in the, in the long legal battle that the Kirby family had with Marvel and Disney, there's testimony where Jack's son, Neil, says, he's asked, like, can you be so sure that that Stan didn't create these characters? And he's like, Stan just didn't have that creative ability, and he was not the kind of person who would have been able to come up with those characters. I'm paraphrasing there.
I have a question for you. Do you think Stan really had that bad a memory? Or do you think he just developed that as a very convenient...
I'm doubtful of that. I mean, you have lots of stories of people talking to him later in life, and him remembering, vividly adventures that he had with, Ken Ball, Jim Mooney, whatever, people from way back in the day. He would remember
Jim Mooney and I were there.
Right. And, that was stuff that he... I mean, I what can I say? I'm not inside his brain. I don't know whether there were just things that he remembered well and then other things he didn't remember well, but he was certainly capable of recalling stuff that happened way back in the past, whether that was selective or just the funny way the human brain works. I didn't do a CAT scan, so I couldn't tell you.
I mean, one of the things, and this is certainly something Heidi can speak to, one of the things that we need to discuss for context is the fact that, like, people working for scale and people, making these creations and not getting credit for them, and certainly not getting like royalties,
ownership
that would come out like 50 years down the road. I mean, the Siegel and Schuster is probably the best known example of like a really huge legal fight over this, but like that was how things were done. And I think partially because at the time, like there was no expectation that people who are working for scale, doing a dinky superhero comic in some pulp magazine that, 50 years from now, it was going to be the biggest pop cultural phenomenon in the world.
You know what? I am going to say that's a little bit of a misnomer, because, when Siegel Schuster did have a lot of paperwork, like their case actually has a lot of, it's very well documented, as far as even the return check, somebody saved that return check, right? So there's actually a lot of paperwork. And, when Bob Kane came along, he was just a teenager, but he had, lawyers in his family and was able to get credit in perpetuity for Batman, even though Bob Kane was a bit of a ass by all accounts. And so, people, yes, absolutely, people signed away everything. totally, just as they do today, as they're doing
Yeah.
right at this moment. But there were certainly a lot of smarter people, like Eisner obviously knew that he should owning the material was the right way to go. I mean, Bob Kane knew it was the right way to go, and various studios were trying even then to get better, better contracts than they, than we think that they were capable of getting, and very few did. But you could make your own. The Bob Kane story is quite interesting, actually, comparing it to
Stan.
Yeah, well, no, to a Siegel and Schuster, obviously.
Oh yes,
and also by. I was talking about this in some other interview I was doing, but it's just that with Superman, Superman was an immediate media hit. Like within a year of Superman coming out, he was on lunchboxes, he was, radio dramas, movie serial. I mean, it wasn't like people did not know, wasn't a slow burn. It wasn't like somebody at National Comics was like, man, we got to build up the Superman. It was like, it was a huge hit.
Do the rollout. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. We got to do the rollout. Yeah. Let's get this.
The tease. We'll have him holding the car, but it's silhouetted. Who is he?
Yeah. So, people, then as now, there was a lot of evidence, and but as you said, Abe, it was a disreputable medium, and that's the main thing. I mean, nobody could go home and say, or back to their high school reunion and be boasting about drawing comics.
Drawing comics, yeah, no. I mean,
whereas if you were a syndicated cartoonist, then you
totally. Well, that's the whole thing.
The castle.
Yeah. Yes. Doing comic strips. That was Stan's dream in the 50s. I mean, he worked really hard at trying to break into comic strips, which is a story that was largely untold until Gare Appledorn, who maybe I'm mispronouncing his name, but went to the archives of Stan's comic strip agent. And she just had this copious amount of documentation that she'd left about Stan's search for work in the comic strip world, like all these pitches that never went anywhere and correspondence like with the Boy Scouts of America while he was doing Mrs. Lyon's Cubs. It's fascinating. I included probably more real estate than maybe a reader might want, but I found it interesting, so maybe they'll find it interesting. And the syndicated cartoonist thing really was just a big rung above doing, comic books for Martin Goodman.
No, I found that section really fascinating. And I mean, I guess one of the things I'm curious about, although this maybe is requiring you a little bit to do a bit of mind reading as well, is to what extent, that one of the threads throughout the book is this, Stan wanting to sort of do bigger things than comics and sort of seeing comics in some way as a fallback. By the end, do you feel like he was fairly sort of, I mean, he must have known who ought he be remembered for? Was he sort of reconciled to this idea that he would be Stan Lee, the Marvel Comics guy?
I don't know. I mean, here's the one insight I have into that sort of thing if we're talking end of life. I heard an audio recording, undated, but based on the voice and what he's talking about, it's presumably relatively late in his life. And in it, he's complaining about POW Entertainment, his second post-Marvel company, the one that still exists. And he's going, I don't understand how in all the years that we've been around, they haven't gotten me a hit movie, something along I'm paraphrasing a little bit there, but basically like, how is it that we don't have our hit movie yet? I don't think he was satisfied by the end. He also didn't really, according to people in his inner circle, he didn't really even like superhero movies. So the fact that he was known for cameos in superhero movies, I mean, according to people close to him, he would do the red carpet and then just leave. Part of that was later on, he was having trouble with his eyesight and his hearing, so it wasn't really a pleasurable experience. But even before that, he apparently just didn't really, I don't know, that's only based on some testimony. I don't want to like log in there that I'm absolutely certain he didn't like superhero movies, but I don't know that he at the end was reconciled. I mean, maybe he accepted it, but I don't know that he felt happy about it, that he was still mainly known as the Marvel Comics guy and not as the big movie mogul or the great novelist or the great syndicated strip creator. I can't read his mind, but there's reason to believe that he still really thought that there was more that he could end up doing. There were still a lot of pacts by the end, to use Heidi's word. There were still a lot of things getting announced, and it was not, just career retrospective. Here's this documentary about my great years at Marvel. It was all him trying to plow ahead.
So we're actually bumping up against an hour, and there was something I wanted to talk to you about, Heidi. So I'm going to ask you a huge question and ask you to just answer it really briefly at the end.
Sure. 7.
Pittsburgh.
It's a very Douglas Adams answer to the question. Something we've been discussing a lot, something that the Beat has certainly been covering a lot is, how big of an impact this past year is going to have on the industry going forward. I mean, obviously I'm thinking of this in 2 ways. First is the direct market, obviously. So just comic stores in general, how people are reading comics, print versus online versus iPads, but also just like the format. I was listening to a few conversations with Ed Brubaker, and he was saying that the past year has really caused him to rethink how he puts comics out into the world, because people aren't really, going to stores and buying floppies, which I don't know, seems like probably a continuation of a trend that's been going on for a while now.
The sales aren't, comics came through COVID just fine, really. Books came through COVID just fine. Obviously there was dings here and there. But the short answer is people need entertainment, especially when they can't do anything. So books and comics provided a pretty nice distraction for people. So, I just saw Publishers Weekly was saying that bookstore sales were way down. Oh, not way down. Something like, 20% down, something like that, which is
that's pretty substantial.
That's pretty substantial, right? But book sales were actually fine last year. That because many comics publishers have told me and gone on the record saying they had their biggest year ever in 2020. Believe it or not.
Yeah.
So comics survived, and with the thing with Brubaker, I do think the periodical has taken a hit just because you couldn't go into the store every week. It was a lot harder, and the direct sales market didn't really figure. When the interregnum came back in April, I guess it was March, April, whatever that was, lost in the seas of time, where no comics are being distributed. They never really figured out the answer for that. It was Diamond went away and then Diamond came back. It's like, let's go through Diamond. But, they never really figured out a different distribution system for them. So that's a choke point. And it's a little fragile choke point, I think we learned.
So, I mean, do you foresee, obviously there's a lot of stores, and this is just retail in general, but there are a lot of stores that have already gone under. Are we talking when it comes to retail and the way that people actually buy comics, is this going to be the beginning of a pretty profound sea change?
Well, I think we're separated into digital sales and digital comics. Digital comics are doing great also, I've heard, certainly through Webtoon and Tapas. Those are big, any kind of streaming kind of webcomics format is great. Digital sales are up, but they have not supplanted print physical comics. And
crazy.
Well, it's not, because people don't, I'm a digital hoarder. So how many digital comics do you think I have on my hard drive? Right. How do you think I could find them? I guess
you're also a real comic hoarder.
Well, I am.
Well, that's the thing. Yes, you have to read a lot of them. Yeah.
Right. I hoard print comics too, but it's that's why I have a fake background. But if I'm walking around my apartment and I suddenly turn around and I can almost touch a book. Actually, I'm far from my books right now. And I see the book and I'm like, I want to read this. Right. But it's unlikely I'll be browsing my hard drive and find something to read.
No, it's true.
Or on my iPad. So it's additive. It's just another way to read them. But Brian, to your point, and with what Ed is saying, the graphic novel won. I can't put it any clearer than that, And I've always been a graphic novel girl too. And I was always like, why are pamphlets number one? And now that the pamphlets sort of embattled, now I'm sort of like, people love comic books.
Oh no, come back! I didn't mean it.
Yeah, well, it's a very sturdy. It's lasted 80 years. That's pretty impressive.
Longer than that. 1933. So
a very long
32, 33. Yeah.
So what does that mean then? Like very specifically, what does that mean for the big two? Obviously, obviously a huge to varying degree between Marvel and DC. You know, a big part of their success has been, probably the primary part of their success has been IP at this point.
Sure, their R&D.
Yeah. So what is that?
Well, I don't, I mean, we should do another episode to just talk about our ideas about Kevin Feige, because, he's the new Stan Lee, really. Like, everybody gives him credit as the architect, but is he?
Yeah.
So, but it's pretty clear that Kevin Feige likes Marvel Comics, the publishing company. He demanded to take over as their creative director, which doesn't mean anything really, but he doesn't run the business side of it, but
he doesn't want them to go away.
He doesn't want them to go away.
Yeah.
Yeah. And of course they've had to cut corners and cut budgets during COVID, as everyone has. But they've stayed really secretive about everything. And, Marvel to me is just chugging along. They're just putting out books, and, WandaVision has brought back the MCU. And so, Marvel's doing just fine. DC, oh my God, what? I don't know. I don't even know what's going on there. Nobody does. It's just like, there's a lot of rumors this week about people trying to buy DC Comics or license DC Comics. And I think that's pretty clear that AT&T is very willing to take this business unit, and that's profitable, by the way, it's profitable, and just move it off somewhere, because that's AT&T. And, which to me, I just think AT&T's track record is incredibly spotty where content is concerned.
Yeah.
And
as somebody whose website is owned by Verizon, I would say that that is absolutely accurate.
Sure. Okay. Well, there you go. Inside it. But no, they haven't shown too much finesse in dealing with content. Since they bought Warner Brothers, and the way they're handling DC Comics doesn't seem to be particularly nuanced or forward looking. And they're pushing the digital comics, pushing digital first. Guess what? They don't make as much money as print comics do. That's a fact.
The key is going to be whoever manages how to actually lock down. I mean, and Heidi, tell me if I'm wrong, and maybe somebody already has figured this out, whether one of the big two can really lock down the market for people who like Raina Telgemeier. I mean, that's where the future of comics is right now, is this like massive hunger among grade schoolers and young adults. And, around thereabouts, most of them young women, girls, and you see the big two trying to grab onto that and get onto that bandwagon. And I just, for the most part, have not seen them. I mean, they don't have a hit on the level. Okay. Feel free to disagree.
No, I actually disagree. I would say that DC, oddly enough, DC is actually making really big strides, because they put out a lot of YA.
I know. Yeah. And I didn't know whether that, I wanted to turn that over to you, because I didn't know how well that was doing.
They're doing quite well. They're doing quite well. I mean, some of them are doing better than others, but it's hard to lose money making kids comics right now.
Yeah. So you answer your own question.
Yeah. So, and Marvel, interestingly, has really flubbed that. But Brian, I'm sure, just FYI, one of the biggest stories of 2021 will be Marvel's pact with Scholastic, because they finally figured out, let's give license to Scholastic, and they can turn out, Spider-Man instead of Dog-Man. So
hey kids, comics.
Yeah.
Well, no, that's it exactly. I mean, I've been saying this for years. I mean, they had the youth market covered with superhero comics, and then they completely dropped the ball on it, because
there's a lot of factors in that.
But everything, like, superhero comics became adult. I mean, they grew up with us, and I think to a certain extent they left younger readers behind.
Yeah, what's the old rhyme that the comics used to be made by adults for kids, and now they're made by fans for nobody? Anyway, not to sound too grim, we're all on Team Comics here. We want the medium to succeed.
We're all excited by the Snyder Cut here.
One of Heidi.
Let's do a live viewing party. That's
live viewing party.
Heidi, what are the odds that you're going to be able to watch that in one sitting?
4 hours? I don't know.
Yeah, I know, it's a long time, man.
I mean,
get like a Camelback and one of those little like pea cups and just dig in.
Man, I'm thinking, I've been toying with the idea of taking some kind of staycation here in New York, or I just check into a hotel. Maybe that's what I should do. Just check into a hotel and
watch the Snyder Cut.
The Snyder Cut, yeah. Get some pizza, some soda, and a couple
Well, you
beers.
get the Snyder Cut meal kit.
Yes!
Yeah, get the Snyder Cut meal kit. Exactly. You don't need the pizza. Just do the big belly
one
burger.
of my writers is getting that.
Oh,
We're getting a
yes,
review
yes.
kit. Yes.
I love it.
Yes.
Experimental.
All right,
Experiential.
everybody.
Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good place to wrap it. Thanks everybody for joining us.
Dude, thanks.
Yeah, thanks.
This was a lot of fun. Yeah, it was
Ton
good
of
to
fun.
connect with all of you.
Abe's book is great. Read it.
Oh, thank you. Should we do our little plugs?
Start. Yeah, let's.
Me? Okay, yeah. So the book is called True Believer, The Rise and Fall of Stan Lee. You can find out more about it, including links to order it and to the sneak preview excerpt that ran in Vulture at abrahamriesman.com, RIESMAN. If you mix up the I and the E, it doesn't matter because I registered that domain name too, and it directs to the proper one. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, I talk too much. It's at Abraham Joseph.
I'm Heidi Mcdonald. You can find me at The Beat at comicsbeat.com. I'm the editor-in-chief there. You'll occasionally find me writing news stories or pontificating like I do on this. And you can find me on all social media at ComixAce, COMIXACE.
Very worth following her. She's very smart and she knows this industry inside and out.
That's very nice of you. I've been posting a lot about hot water bottles this week.
Listen, Anthony and I decided to have Heidi on because we wanted a ringer. We wanted like somebody who could actually like come in with real information. Anthony?
I write for TechCrunch.com. You can also follow me on Twitter at Anthony Ha, and I co-host a podcast called Original Content, which will very shortly be independent. So follow us.
Hey, Mazel Tov.
Nice.
Exciting.
Awesome. I also write for TechCrunch. I do a podcast called RIYL, which is the YouTube channel that you're watching right now. A newsletter, Substack. It's beheater.substack.com. Let's do this again. Everybody, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Brian.
Yeah.
Thank you, Abe. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Bye, viewers.
And I got a little surprise I'm going to take us out on.
Oh, fun.
Stand a little straighter, walk a little prouder, be an innovator, laugh a little louder, grow forever greater, we can show you how to. Where will you be then? You'll belong, you'll belong, you'll belong, you'll belong to the Merry Marble Marching Society. March along, march along, march along to the song of the Merry Marble Marching Society. If you growl, if you groan, with the dour, sour outlook, if you howl, if you moan, you can lose your sour grub for keeping trim and in step with the vim and the pep of the Merry Marble Marching Society.
Be an early riser.
Strive to be ambitious.
Speak a little wiser.
Try to be judicious.
Be a good advisor.
Never ever vicious.
And where will you be then?
You belong,